Hi, I'm Dr. Carolyn Wiley, founder of Rose and Pearl Publishing, and this is the Publish Pearl podcast, where we show you how to turn your message into a book that builds authority, attracts the right people, and multiplies your impact long after you've written the last page.
Writing is your book is not the hard part. I know, that sounds backwards. You've been staring at a blank page for 6 months. You've rearranged your outline 17 times. You've started chapter 1, deleted it, started again, decided maybe you should start on chapter 8. And I'm here telling you writing's not the hard part. Well, it's not. The hard part is what comes after. The hard part is making a complete stranger, someone who has never heard of you, who owes you nothing, who is busy, distracted, and drowning in content, care enough to stop, pick up your book, pay for it, read it, and then tell someone else about it. That is the hard part. And if you're not willing to go all in on that, the marketing, the visibility, the selling, then I need to ask you a serious question. What is the point of you writing the book at all? So today's guest has spent his entire career answering that question. He said in Forbes, years before I understood what a customer acquisition funnel was, I understood something more fundamental: how to make a stranger care. That's it. After all, what every author must do, you have to sit down with nothing but a blank page and a story only you can tell. And somehow, through craft, persistence, and a healthy disregard for the odds, you convince millions of people that your words are worth their most precious resource: time. My guest today is not just an author, he is an entrepreneur who writes books. And today we're going to discuss the business of writing. J.D. Barker, a New York Times and international best-selling author. His books have sold millions of copies in more than 150 countries. He co-writes with names such as James Patterson. He's been personally invited by Bram Stoker's family to write the prequel to Dracula using original unpublished notes. He's built his own publishing imprint, Hampton Creek Press, and then structured a distribution deal with Simon & Schuster entirely on his own terms. He is not a writer who got lucky. He's an entrepreneur who built a publishing business, and he has an incredible product in his books. JD, welcome to the Publish Pearl.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. God, you make it seem like it's a lot of work.
And it can be, right? But at the same time, if it's not an absolute joy, then what are we doing, right?
Yeah, well, I think I came at this from a very different angle than a lot of authors do. I mean, I've always loved writing fiction, but I had been told at an early age you can't make a living as an author. You have to get a real job. So I ended up working in finance for 20 some years. I was at an investment banking firm. I was their chief compliance officer. So I would come home and I would write at night to stay sane. But during the daytime, I saw companies, literally go from an idea in somebody's backyard, to the public, to becoming an IPO and trading publicly. And I saw the process that it took to get everything from A to B to Z. It's basically, it's a very repetitive formula. It doesn't matter if you're selling bananas, you're selling boats, or you're selling books. You're selling a widget at the end of the day. So I think I've always had that mentality, even when I started writing fiction. So I've come at this from a very different way, I think, than most authors do.
But I think that's been part of the key to your success, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Because the first thing that I did before I even sent my first book off to an agent is I walked into Barnes and Noble, and just stood at the front door and looked in, and not as as an author, but as a consumer. What's grabbing my eye? Who is like, here's the household names, and like they're big on these book covers. The title is nice and small. Debut authors tend to have the opposite. The title of the book is huge, and their name is this tiny little print. Like I noticed all these little differences. And made a conscious effort from jump to basically overcome all that.
I love that. So that's exactly where I want to start, is you realized that writing a book and selling a book and creating that publishing business are really about the same thing. The skill is persuasion. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, as authors, I think we're all very introverted. We love being behind the
Mhm.
desk all by ourselves. The last thing we want to do is talk to other people. But for me, at 11:30 every morning, I take off my author hat, I put on my business hat, and finish out the day, as an entrepreneur, which is a conscious decision. I mean, I started this. My first book was indie published, and I did a bunch of traditional titles. When you go traditional, they take a lot of that heavy lifting off your plate,
Right.
but they also take away the control. And
Yes.
I didn't like losing that control, which is why I ultimately struck that deal with Simon and Schuster. But customer acquisition is no different than picking up a reader, and I think every author needs to take a step back. Like, I think you need to write the perfect book, which is a big ask to begin with, but you need a 5-star read, before you even leave the gate.
Right.
And without that, I think you're kind of dead in the water. I mean, I've done tons of different marketing things, but the one that works over and over again is word of mouth. If you
Mhm.
can't generate word of mouth on a book, it tends to fizzle and die unless you throw a lot of dollars at it. So you have to start with a really good book, and then you have to figure out how to put it in the hands of somebody. I believe I just read, if I remember this right, 4 million books were published last year,
Yep.
which is a crazy number to think about. And as an author, your book is one. So
Mhm.
somehow you have to figure out how to stand out in that crowd. And what I see a lot of authors do is they look at what everybody else is doing and they say, okay, this is working for this person, this is working for that person. I'm going to do these two things, and that's it's a viable business model. But if you're doing the same thing as everybody else, you're never going to achieve a level above them, which is, I think, ultimately what if you're in this as a business, if you're trying to make money, if you're trying to make a living, or in my case, I'm trying to become a household name.
Right.
You need to be up here, not down here with everybody else. You have to come up with something that's going to separate you from that pack.
Absolutely. And you mentioned one of those things that you did. So I want to dive into that. You had indie published titles, you had traditional published titles, and I talk all the time on this channel about how neither one is good or bad. They're different models, and it's deciding which one fits for you. But then you came up with a hybrid model that kind of is different than any of the hybrid models people think of. They think of hybrid as paying someone to do the heavy lifting and then you recouping the royalties on the back end. But that's kind of what you did, but not fully. So help us understand, like you just said, we have to think outside of the box and not do what everyone else is doing. And that's what you did with Simon and Schuster. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, initially my first book, it was indie published, and I think because of that, I got a taste for everything business.
Mhm.
But I sold a lot of copies, and that put me on the radar of the traditional publishers. So my next couple of books, I sold it to the traditional marketplace for some fairly lucrative deals,
Mhm.
and I gave away a lot of that control. And I initially agreed to do that, not because I had to. Like, I knew what kind of money I could make as an indie. I could probably have made more, but because I wanted a peek behind the curtain. I wanted to know what
Yes.
they were doing that I wasn't doing. I wanted to see what they could do that I couldn't possibly do. And when they finally did pull back that curtain, I realized they're not doing anything that I can't actually do on my own. If you strive, if you push hard enough, you can get all of these things done. I think the only door that they can open that you may not be able to as an indie author is getting you into things like bookstores,
Right.
particularly the big box
The big
stores, like
box stores. Yeah.
Costco, Target, Walmart. That's a very difficult thing to do, which I started, the hybrid approach, similar to what you had mentioned. But when I think of hybrid, like I called my agent one day on a book, it was called A Caller's Game. And I said, I'm going to retain English rights for myself. I'm going to
Mm.
publish those on my own. You can go ahead and sell to all the foreign publishers. So in my mind, that's what a hybrid approach is. We've
Yeah.
got some
Yeah.
traditional publishers involved. I've got my indie market, handled over here. So it's kind of a mix of both.
Yeah.
But as an indie author, even doing that, I still wasn't able to get into those particular places. Which is why I pursued the deal with Simon and Schuster. That came about in an odd way too. I mean, I used to work in finance. Private equity bought Simon and Schuster, so I reached out to
Mm.
people that were involved with that, and that's kind of how I got those conversations started. Because I knew that with a private equity firm buying a company like Simon and Schuster, they were going to look at it completely different. They weren't looking at
Right.
this as a publisher anymore. They were looking at it as a business that sells
Mhm.
something, and they don't care what that something is, and they're going to push that company to do their best. But that also means they have to do things that are outside of their comfort zone. Random House, HarperCollins, these other guys, they've been publishing books the exact same way, literally from the beginning, and they haven't really changed all that much. But Simon and Schuster, has become a disruptor. Amazon is another complete disruptor in their model, and I prefer to be with the guys that are at the front lines.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of those front lines, where do you see publishing going now that you do have Amazon disrupting the market and you have these new ideas out there and so many more indie authors than we've ever seen before in the publishing industry?
Well, I think the deal that I struck, it was new at the time. I don't think it's unique anymore. I think you're going to see a lot more of these things happen. Because if you think about how this works, if an indie author is selling, a ridiculous number of titles, they're getting roughly 70 cents on the dollar. Financially, they're
Hmm.
doing very well. If that was a traditionally published title, they'd be lucky to get 15 or 20 cents on the dollar.
Right.
They may move more books and, at the end of the day, it may, work itself out. But, you make a lot of money as an indie author. So if a traditional publisher sees that, and trust me, they are looking at those charts. They
Hmm.
know who those successful indie authors are. Might walk up to one of them and say, "Hey, we will give you $1 million for your next title," and that indie author is going to say no because there is literally no reason for them to take that deal. Why give up all the things that they have to give up to make that happen? But if the same publisher, and this could be HarperCollins, it could be Random
Hmm.
House, it could be Simon and Schuster, if they go to that same indie author and say, "Let's create a partnership. You own your publishing imprint. We'll handle your print sales and distribution. Let's approach this as, two businesses working together to sell titles." Now, all of a sudden, you're an indie author who can get your books into those big box stores, who can get into the catalogs, who can get in front of the film and TV people without giving up the freedom that you had before. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that kind of thing happen. I honestly think the big publishers have to do something like that in order to
Yeah.
survive, or we may not see some of these names around in another 5 or 10 years.
That's so, so important because then that actually gives hope to people who are like, well, I haven't gone through an agent yet. I haven't been seeking out these traditional deals. I really want to retain that control, but how am I going to get in those big box stores? And it gives them an option of being able to do that with the hard work of that marketing and visibility. So I want to go there for a second. Um, Something I keep upstairs is based on a real haunted island, right?
Right.
And so, how did you create a marketing strategy around that within the creative concept? Because from what I've heard, that's been very unique.
Yes, anytime I'm ready to sell a new book, I look at what everybody else is doing to sell books. I'll make a list of that, and then I try to come up with something unique that nobody is doing. I live on a little island off the coast of New England called Newcastle, and I go for a run every day. And at one point, when I'm crossing the beach, if I look out over the water, there's another island right off our coast, about a quarter mile out, with a tiny little house on it all by itself. It's like maybe an acre. For the longest time, I had an idea for a haunted house book. I had the tagline
Mhm.
written down in my little file of ideas, and the tagline was, "For a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die."
Ooh.
I didn't want to create the same haunted house story that we've seen over and over again.
Mhm.
Husband and wife buy a house, they move in, something bad happens, something worse happens. They do a little bit of research and realize something horrible happened, and then
Right.
either they fix it or it completely devolves and destroys everybody. But we've seen that movie a million times. We've read that
Mhm.
book over and over again. So I took it down to the grain level, like what creates a haunted house. So in my book, a 17-year-old kid inherits the house from his grandmother. She passes away. She leaves him a house on a private island in a trust fund. And he does exactly what you would expect with that. He's 17 years old. He turns it into a party house for him and his friends. But even after a little while, partying gets a little bit old. Somebody raises their hand and say, "Hey, what would it take to turn this house, perfectly normal house, into a haunted house?" So they start exactly where you would expect. They tell a couple of scary stories. Somebody
Mhm.
brings a Ouija board, but the tagline for the book: "For a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die." So you know where they're going, but the book is
Right.
all about the journey to get there. So I knew I had a strong concept. We optioned it for the film side very, very quickly, but I needed to come up with a way to market this book, and it is based on a real house. And I had gotten to know the people who owned this house while I was writing the book. It used to be a Coast Guard life saving station the last time it was actually used. And this was like the 40s or 50s. It sat empty for almost 50 years and was falling apart. A local guy raised enough money to restore it, with his ultimate goal being to turn it into a museum. So I got to know him, and I took a bunch of trips out to the house as he was rebuilding this place. Ultimately, he decorated the interior of the house to match what I have in the book, which is really cool.
Oh, that is
Um,
super cool.
but when it came time to market it, my marketing brain just said, "Let's give away an overnight stay." So that's what we ultimately did. We put out a press release saying an author is giving away an overnight stay in a haunted house, the basis of his book. As soon as that press release happened, I got a ton of press, TV, radio, they all wanted to talk to the author that was giving away an overnight stay in a haunted house. On social media, everybody was buzzing about it. I'll do it. Will you do it? I won't do it if you don't do it. Maybe I'll do it if you go. But like everybody was talking about it. All of that was free.
Oh,
It
that's
was just
incredible.
because of an idea. Now somebody else could come along and they can give away an overnight stay in a haunted house, but it's not going to hit as hard because it's already been
Exactly.
done. So like that's the hard part. That's the heavy lifting. You have to come up with some idea that's so unique, but also tied to your book, your product, that nobody else could do it, and you have to be first to the table. And it's only going to work one time.
That is so important because it's really not about, like you talked about earlier, throwing a bunch of money into ads or promos or things like that. It's about spending the time to do the hard work of figuring out that unique angle for your book, because your book's unique angle is not going to work for the next person's unique book. It's going to have to be something specific to the book. That is such a great marketing lesson for authors today. All right. So speaking of that authorship, you have co-authored with some big names such as James Patterson. How do you actually make co-authorship work? Do you walk into it like it's a business partnership more than a creative partnership? Tell us more about that.
It's definitely a mix of both. So when I was working in finance, I couldn't give up the writing ghost. I
Mhm.
had to keep doing that. So at night, I would work on these, other projects, and a lot of them were what I call book doctor projects. So I would get hired by agents, by editors, sometimes other authors to, take a book that was, almost ready for prime time, but not quite there, and I would rewrite it and get it, to the point where it could be published. And I had, 20 some years of talking to editors, where they were very candid with me with what was wrong with the book.
Yeah.
Like a lot of times an editor, like they'll call me and they tend to sugarcoat stuff. If they have a problem they want you to fix, they'll tell you 5 things that are great about your book. Then they're going to tell you that one little thing they need you to tweak. Then they tell you 3 more things they love about the book before they hang up on that phone call.
Right.
But when you're a hired gun brought in to actually fix a book, they don't sugarcoat anything. They tell you
No.
everything that's wrong with that title straight from the get go. So I did a ton of those. I also wrote a lot of memoirs for other people. So I interviewed political figures, sports figures, actors and actresses, and then I would have to sit down and write a book in first person, from their point of view, which I think really helped me with creating characters. But I
Mhm.
did all that for 20 some years while I was working in the finance world, and I think because of that, like I really learned how to write, and I really learned how to work with other people. So when I sat down to write my first solo title, that actually felt weird to me, to be in a room all by myself. So collaborating to me is second nature. I've been doing it from the get go. When I work with other people, though, I think it's very similar to having 2 people in the kitchen cooking breakfast at the same time. You have to
Mhm.
figure out who's good at what, and you have to divide and conquer. If
Yeah,
you both try to make eggs at the same time, you're going to trip over each other. But if one person
exactly.
makes eggs while the other one's making bacon, it all works out. So it's just, very important to establish those parameters from the beginning. Figure out who's going to handle what. Come up with a game plan before you start writing. I've seen plenty of people, just start. You write chapter 1, I'll write chapter 2. You take this character, I'll take this character. However you divide it, but if you don't come up with that ahead of time, you're going to end up with a lot of extra work on the second draft, the third draft, the fourth draft, trying to get it all fine tuned. So I think you have to approach it from that angle, and for a lot of people, it's a difficult thing. I like the fact that I'm working with somebody else, and together we're basically creating something that neither of us could have created on our own. I think
Yes.
that's why I'm so attracted to working with co-authors.
Absolutely. My biggest published title is actually one most people don't even realize is a title of mine because it's a statistics textbook that's been one of the leading textbooks on the market in that area for 20 years. And I have 2 co-authors, and we laugh that I'm the gas, one of the other ones is the engine, and one of the others is the brake. Like I'm always like, yes, let's go. We got it all in. And the other one just keeps us making sure we're moving forward. And then the other one is like, okay, I know Carolyn said this was a good idea, but I don't know if this is a great idea. Let's stop and rethink this. And it's worked for us. And I've joked that they're my longest marriage because we've been together writing this series of books for 20 something years. So I love that. Another thing I want to touch on today is that you mention in many of your bios and stuff that you were diagnosed with autism at 22 and you openly call it your superpower. What does that mean specifically for how you write? And How does your brain give you that competitive edge in the marketing and publishing world?
Well, I think it was 2 different things very early on. If you've ever known anybody that is autistic,
Mm,
a lot of us tend to mimic what we see happen, with other people, and particularly in social situations. So if I'm standing at a party with 4 or 5 other people, somebody cracks a joke, I'm gonna laugh because the people around me are laughing, not necessarily because I find the joke funny.
mm,
I've learned over time to mimic the actions of what quote unquote normal people do in these types of situations. One of the things that I learned that I can also do is I can mimic people on paper. So if you hand me
yes.
something written by somebody else, I can read that text and I can pick up on their vocabulary, their cadence, their writing style, and I can continue writing it in their voice, which is one of the reasons why I did the prequel to Dracula for Bram Stoker's family. I was able
Mhm.
to write it using Bram's voice, to the point where I couldn't tell the difference between what Bram had written and we lifted from his notes versus what I had written.
That's so
So that
good.
came in very handy, when I was helping publishers, work on other people's books, tweaking stuff, finishing stuff, whatever it might be, writing memoirs. That was very, very helpful. And the other thing is just patterns. I'm very good at recognizing patterns. I've never had any formal training in writing, but I started reading at 3. And yeah, I read, first I started with like a Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews, and I read all the
Mhm.
classics, Charles Dickens and Mark Twain. But like the pattern of a good story just got ingrained in my head. And like you can take any one of my books and drop them into a 3-act structure and it's going to fit perfectly. But it's not
Yeah.
because I, plotted it that way. It's just because as I'm writing, I get to a certain point and my brain just knows this needs to happen now.
Yeah.
And if I don't do it now, it's almost like I'm on a road trip and I just missed my turn. I got to throw the car in reverse and I got to go back to that spot and pick up where I left off. Otherwise, something just feels wrong. So I think the pattern recognition is a huge part of it. I'm able to plot out intricate plot lines and keep it all up here. Um, for better or worse, it's my brain is a very cluttered place right now. It feels like an attic with a lot of stuff in it.
I love that. And coming from a very neurodiverse household, I love bringing that topic of neurodiversity into the conversation so that authors realize that, hey, they might actually have an advantage with some of these things that they have instead of it being a disadvantage.
Yeah, I speak to a lot of parents of autistic children, and that's one of the things that I really focus on in those initial conversations because they might have an 18-month-old child that's literally sitting on the floor, banging its head against the wall until it
Mhm.
bleeds. And they're looking at like, how am I going to get to the end of this? Like, where's my life going? And and one of the things I point out very early on is when you get to the point where you can communicate with your kid, find out what they like. It doesn't matter what it is, but if you hone in on that one little thing, that's going to open that door of communication between you and them. And once that door is open, you can work on all the rest. And I have yet to run into an autistic child that doesn't have that doorway.
Exactly. Same. That's been my experience as well. And so, with, for example, right now, you've got the 4MK prequels coming out, you've got a Flatliner screenplay, multiple co author projects. I'm imagining that this same superpower allows you to manage all of these multiple book worlds at once. Like you said, your brain's a messed up attic right now without losing the thread. Talk about that.
Yeah, I feel like I need multiple projects just to not be bored. Like I don't know if you can see it, but there's a typewriter behind me on a table over there, and every day when I walk by, I type one sentence on a novel that I'm writing on this typewriter.
Oh, that's so good.
I've got another book that I'm writing by hand on notepads, and I find that my voice is different in every one of those things. But as soon as I walk away from that typewriter, I'm on to another project. When I put that notepad down, I'm on to another project. When I'm sitting at my desk working on Scrivener, I'm on that project.
Mhm.
So I'm able to, to move from one to the next without them getting too cluttered. The only time I've honestly had a problem with it was when I was working on Dracula, mainly because I was writing that while I was writing one of the books in the 4MK series. And I noticed that, Victorian English vernacular was sneaking into modern day Chicago and vice versa. So I needed to put a little bit more separation between those two things. But, other than that, it's gotten easier.
So, do you think that those format differentiators where you have Scrivener, you have the handwriting, you have the typewriter, does that help your brain to context switch between one world and the next?
It definitely helps with that, and I also find that my voice is very different. My voice on the typewriter, it's almost like a detective noir story.
Mm,
The handwritten thing, it's in first person, present tense. It's a very personal type story, and I think handwriting just sort of feels like that's what it should generate.
mhm.
I have no problem writing in third person, past tense on Scrivener. If that's
Yeah.
so, the vehicle and stuff is all very important. I've got a podcast called Writers Inc. where we've interviewed literally every big name author out there, and we always get two things out of them. We get their origin story and we get their writing process. And I think we're coming up on episode 400 now. And I have yet to hear the same writing process from two different people.
Oh,
Everybody is completely different. So when I listen to those interviews, I try to pick out, hey, that might be something that works for me. Let me try that. And I am constantly trying these new things. And if it works, I keep it. If it doesn't work, I toss it aside. But as an author, I feel like the day that I stop learning how to do this or trying to learn is probably the day that I retire.
absolutely, absolutely, and I'm gonna make sure for those listening that I have the link to that podcast link below in the show notes so that y'all can go and check it out and binge some of those episodes. So, this is just an unusual question. Your books deal with darkness and evil, the supernatural. What is your personal relationship with those themes? Do you believe in the dark that you write about?
Well, when it comes to the supernatural, I'm smart enough to realize there's a lot that I don't understand. So I try to keep an open mind to it. I think a lot of it stems from the early reading that I did. I
Mm,
mentioned that I started with Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, then Charles Dickens, Mark Twain. My mom owned an antique store, so we used to go to a lot of garage sales.
yeah.
And I remember going to one when I was 8 years old, and a guy had a box of books, and sitting on top of that box was a copy of Dracula. And I picked it up and I looked at the back and looked at the cover. I was like, this is not something I should be reading. It felt like a very adult book to me. But my mom let me buy it. I took it home and it scared me half to death. For
Yeah.
like 3 weeks, I slept with the lights on. I'm checking under the bed, opening the closet door. And it's the first time a book had ever given me that type of an emotional reaction. And I think I've been chasing that feeling as a reader and a writer ever since. I discovered Stephen King shortly after
Mhm.
that. So there's something about the scary, supernatural, paranormal stuff that I really like. But I sell a lot more thrillers than I do the paranormal and horror. So like I have to balance all that from a business standpoint. So I tend to bounce back and forth. But I think, if given a choice, I would probably write a horror novel.
I love that, and so that's really what drew you to that, because that was gonna be one of my next questions is what drew you to this genre to begin with, and so I think you kind of answered it, but feel free to tell us more.
Well, one of the things, because I worked behind the scenes in publishing for so long, I saw something that kind of scared me. I saw a lot of authors that had a book that hit big, and all of a sudden they had to keep writing that same book, but different over and
Mhm.
over and over again.
Mhm.
I love to pick on Lee Child. He's a great example of
Yep.
this. His real name is not Lee Child. If you go to his Wikipedia page, it tells you the full story. But he was writing under different pen names, and all of a sudden he wrote this book under Lee Child, and the Jack Reacher books just happened to
Mhm.
take off. So he got stuck writing this series forever and ever, and it was obviously a fantastic money generator. But he got bored, so ultimately he quit and retired and handed it off to his brother. And he's sitting at a ranch somewhere. I'm hoping he's writing the book he really wants to write. But I didn't want to get caught up in all that, and I
Yeah.
phoned a friend of mine, Dean Koontz. I think a lot of people know who he is. He's been
Mhm.
around for a while, but he told me if you don't want to get stuck writing the same book, make sure you set that tone from the very beginning. So he helped me craft the text that you see on my Wikipedia page today. And it basically says I'm a suspense author who may include elements of horror, sci-fi, this or that, but suspense is my common thread. And then as I started publishing books, I put out a horror novel first, then I wrote a thriller, then I wrote another horror novel. I purposely bounced back and forth from genre to genre, which irritated my agents, it irritated the publishers. But what I'm finding now is I can use it as almost like I'm a literary Pied Piper. At
Yes.
one point, my agent or my editor told me, we've just done some math and it looks like your readership is women 45 and over. So you need to write a book for women 45 and over. So I turned in a young adult book because my general thinking was if I've already got women 45 and over, I need to get this group over here and bring them into the fold. So by writing a
Exactly.
young adult book, all of a sudden I was able to do that. So now when I write a new book, I look at what markets I'm not currently getting readers from and I target
Mm.
that market and then bring them into the fold and expand my readership that way.
That is so good. That's literally the very first conversation I have with any author that's coming to me for coaching is, "What reader are you trying to get?" Because that shapes everything else about what is you're gonna write. What is that gonna sound like? What's the genre that you're gonna pick for that? So that is very interesting. All right, one last question as we close out this conversation, and I ask this to all of my interviewees. After someone finishes watching this interview, what is the one thing you want them to walk away believing that they didn't begin believing when they started?
Well, I think a lot of people, after they watch this, they're going to go out and Google me, and they're going to see a lot of articles. They're going to see a lot of things that I've done. Crazy. I've captured lightning in a bottle multiple times.
Uh-huh.
I don't want anybody to be overwhelmed by that. So I think what you really need to take away is, if you go back 10 years ago, I didn't have a publishing deal. I had 0 people on my email list. I was an author starting at, ground level, just like everybody else. It's just all about the decisions that I made along the way to get there. And that's what it's really about. The writing career, I think, is really about perseverance. You're going to hear no a lot. A lot of people are going to tell you what you can't do. You need to push through all that and just keep going.
That is such good advice. Thank you so much for sharing that. Because the overnight successes that we see, we only think they're overnight successes because we didn't see the 10 years that went in before we came to our attention.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, for everyone listening, tell us where they can find you and what your new projects are that you would love for them to check out. And I'll be sure to link all of that below.
Sure. I mean, the easiest place to find me is jdbarker.com. I'm on all the social media sites at jdbarker. And the next book coming out, it's a prequel to my 4MK series. It's called The First Scarlet Door. Releases this September. It's going to be in bookstores everywhere.
That is awesome. Thank you so, so much, JD, for being here today. And for everyone listening, remember, he didn't start out with the bestseller. He started out helping other people fix their manuscripts, and he learned what a story needed to do before he ever put his name on one. He was a student of the craft before he mastered it. And that is a path that is available to you. And if you are a faith-driven entrepreneur who knows a book is inside you, but you're not sure how to actually make that work for your business, that's exactly what we do inside Christian Writers Arise and Rose and Pearl Publishing. The link is in the show notes. And this episode has made you want to go and grab the pen and paper today or check out JD's newest book. Please share it with people that you love. Tag JD, tag me, and let's get this conversation into the hands of every entrepreneur who thinks that they're not an author yet. I'm Dr. Carolyn Wiley. This is The Published Pearl, and I will see you next time.
You're listening to the Published Pearl podcast, where your message becomes the book that opens doors your hustle never could. This podcast is produced by Rose and Pearl Publishing and powered by peppermint mocha lattes and the slightly aggressive belief that your book is not optional.